Among the thick trees and under a clear November sky,
we got a little deer stand around the corner here that we sit at.
A message delivered by the winds was found here by 𝐬𝐮𝐬𝐽 and her family.
Alicia was murdered by her caretaker at 16 months old. The caretaker still walks today.
It didn't take us long to trace that note back to the Baker family in Dunlap, Iowa, and the story behind the tragic life and death of 16-month-old baby Alissa Guernsey.
In a small town in Indiana, a little girl came into the world with a bright smile and a heart full of love. Her family called her their little beauty, and her laughter filled their home with warmth. No one could have imagined that the very system meant to protect children would not only fail her, but play a role in a tragedy that would shock the nation. The story of Alissa Guernsey is not just about loss. It's about how easily the most vulnerable can be overlooked, and how incredibly hard it is to find justice once the damage is done. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and share this video. Stories like this need to be heard to help prevent them from happening again. Alissa was born in December 2007 to Kelly Sprunger and Mike Guernsey. She was a beautiful baby, adored by her parents and two older siblings, 6-year-old Lily and 3-year-old Noah. She even shared a birthday with her mother, which made their bond extra special. Life should have been filled with love and laughter for Alissa, but fate had other plans. In November 2008, when Alissa was just 1 year old, her father, Mike, lost his life in a tragic car accident. It was a devastating loss, one that changed everything for the Guernsey family. Kelly suddenly found herself alone, grieving and trying to care for her children while battling her own struggles. Life had never been easy for Kelly. She had faced personal challenges, including depression and past issues with the law, which had temporarily led to her losing custody of her older children. After Mike's passing, she did her best to hold things together, but Child Services believed she wasn't coping well enough. They suggested that Alissa be placed in temporary care until Kelly could get back on her feet. Not wanting to send her daughter to strangers, Kelly turned to her cousin, 29-year-old Christy Schaffer, and her husband, 34-year-old Matthew Schaffer, for help. In December 2008, just before Alissa turned 13 months old, a judge approved the arrangement, and she was placed in the Schaffer household. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect solution. Alissa would be with family, not in foster care. But sometimes, the worst dangers don't come from strangers. At first, things appeared normal. Just days after moving in, Alissa was taken to a pediatrician, Dr. John Egley, for a routine checkup. He found her to be a happy, healthy little girl with no signs of trouble. But that would be the last time anyone described her that way. Only 5 days later, the Schaffers missed a scheduled court hearing, claiming that Christy had a migraine and the kids weren't feeling well. While this might have seemed like a small issue, it was the first red flag in a disturbing pattern. Christy would repeatedly make excuses to avoid oversight, ensuring that no one got too close. Meanwhile, financial stress was growing in the Schaffer home. Matthew's unemployment checks and the occasional child support payments weren't enough to cover the needs of their large family. On January 6, 2009, Christy filed a request to have Lily's monthly Social Security benefits of $637 transferred to her. Money was tight, and tensions in the household were rising. On January 12th, social workers from Child Services visited the home. They saw no immediate cause for concern. Christy assured them that Alissa was adjusting well and even sleeping better. Satisfied, they left. But behind closed doors, things were taking a dark turn. By mid-January, Christy was overwhelmed, but instead of asking for help, she took out her frustrations on Alissa. The once cheerful little girl, who had been so full of life, started to change. Her bright energy faded. She became pale, withdrawn, and covered in bruises. Over the next 3 months, Christy's treatment of Alissa grew worse. She would yell at her, pull her hair, and handle her roughly. The little girl, who had once been surrounded by love, was now living in fear. Christy took Alissa to the doctor frequently, always with new explanations for her injuries. On January 27th, Alyssa needed stitches for a small cut on her forehead. Christy claimed she had simply fallen. A week later, the stitches were removed. Then, on February 5th, Christy reported the injury to Child Services, but at the same time, she asked if she could claim Kelly's children as dependents on her tax return. Had this been an isolated incident, it might not have raised suspicion, but Alyssa kept returning to the doctor with new injuries. On February 9th, Kelly was supposed to have a scheduled visit with her children, but Christy canceled, saying Alyssa and Noah were sick. This was already the second time she had done this in just a few weeks. The next day, Child Services conducted another visit and found all the children to be perfectly healthy. It was becoming clear that Christy was deliberately keeping them away from their mother. Then, just a few days later, on February 14th, Valentine's Day, Christy took Alyssa to the doctor again. This time, she claimed the little girl was losing her hair and bruising too easily. Dr. 𝐬𝐫𝐫 examined Alyssa and was deeply concerned. He noted a rash, scabs, and unexplained bruises all over her small face. Alarmed, he ran multiple tests, searching for answers. But the real answer wasn't a medical condition. It was something far more sinister. It wasn't surprising that every medical test Alyssa went through came back normal. She was a perfectly healthy child, except for the growing number of unexplained injuries. But somehow, none of this raised any red flags for Dr. 𝐬𝐫𝐫. Despite over a dozen visits where Alyssa mysteriously showed up with new bruises or wounds, he never once suspected mistreatment. Instead, he accepted Christy's explanations at face value. She claimed Alyssa had fetal alcohol syndrome and lacked proper prenatal care, saying she was born with health issues. But medical reports from Alyssa's birth completely disproved this. When that excuse didn't hold up, Christy suggested Alyssa might have leukemia, insisting that was the reason for her hair loss. Yet after multiple tests and consultations with specialists, no signs of cancer were found. Christy continued to paint a picture of Alyssa as clumsy and fragile. She talked endlessly about the baby gates she installed, the safety measures she put in place, and all the precautions she claimed to take. But it was all a smokescreen to hide what was really going on. On February 18th, Christy called Child Services, saying Alyssa might have leukemia. That same day, the caseworkers informed Kelly, Alyssa's mother. Understandably alarmed, Kelly wanted to see her daughter and check on her herself. Then, on February 24th, Alyssa was taken to the doctor for a cough and congestion. Tests showed nothing unusual. But just a day later, she was back in the doctor's office again, this time for unexplained vomiting and digestive issues. By this point, Kelly was growing increasingly worried and voiced her concerns to Child Services. But her fears were dismissed, and she wasn't the only one being shut out. On February 26th, the father of Alyssa's half-siblings, 𝐬𝐿𝐶𝐭, contacted Child Services, saying Christy was avoiding his calls and keeping him from seeing his kids. This was the start of a clear pattern. Christy was deliberately cutting off all outside contact. And when it came to Alyssa, she was especially careful. Anytime Kelly tried to visit, there was an excuse. Alyssa was sick. She was sleeping. She was too fussy. Christy was doing everything possible to keep Alyssa hidden, and the reason was obvious. She was trying to cover up the truth. Despite more than a dozen doctor visits, Dr. 𝐬𝐫𝐫 never once suspected what was really happening. But for those who actually loved Alyssa, the signs were impossible to ignore. On the rare occasions when relatives saw her, they noticed a heartbreaking change. The once playful, happy little girl had become quiet and fearful, and the physical signs of her suffering were becoming harder to overlook. By early March 2009, things had gotten much worse. On March 3rd, Alyssa was taken to the doctor again, this time with an injury to her left arm. The doctor also noticed a bruise near her eye and more patches of missing hair. Christy's excuse. She claimed the family's hyperactive dogs had knocked Alyssa down, and once again, Dr. 𝐬𝐫𝐫 believed her. In fact, he even called Child Services himself, telling them he had no concerns. 2 days later, on March 5th, a CT scan revealed something far more serious. Alyssa's arm was broken. She was examined by Dr. Robert Fallon, a specialist from Riley Hospital for Children. Like the previous doctors, he found no medical condition to explain her ongoing injuries. But instead of asking the hard questions, Dr. Fallon came up with an almost unbelievable theory. He suggested Alyssa might have broken her arm by moving too much in her crib at night. A toddler breaking her arm just by tossing and turning? The logic didn't add up. But rather than dig deeper, Dr. Fallon let the issue drop. Before I continue this heartbreaking story, I want to take a moment to ask for your support. If you believe these stories need to be told, please leave a comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Consider becoming a channel sponsor to help me continue shedding light on cases like Alyssa's, stories that deserve to be heard. Every comment, share, and subscription helps ensure these tragedies aren't forgotten. Now, let's talk about what happened on March 28, 2009, the day everything came to a devastating end. That Saturday started like any other. The kids woke up early, had breakfast, and played in the cramped living room of the Schaffer home. No one knew that for little Alyssa this would be her last day. That evening, around 6:45 p.m., Christy decided to take Alyssa and a few other kids, including Lily, out to rent a movie and pick up food from McDonald's. What should have been a simple, fun outing turned into something horrific. At some point during the car ride, Christy snapped. Maybe Alyssa cried. Maybe she did something Christy didn't like. The exact trigger is unknown. But what is certain is that Christy unleashed her full rage on the little girl. Right there in the car, Christy lashed out, causing Alyssa to lose consciousness. Lily, sitting nearby, watched in horror as Alyssa's head slumped against the window. Christy, realizing something was terribly wrong, kept stopping the car to check on her. But rather than call for help, she told Lily to keep quiet. When Alyssa didn't wake up, Christy started to panic. Lily, terrified, asked, "What's wrong with Alyssa?" Christy's response, "Stop asking about it." All this time, Alyssa was making strange, gurgling sounds, an alarming sign of severe head trauma. It was a clear medical emergency. But instead of rushing to a hospital, Christy drove home as if nothing had happened. By the time they arrived back at the house around 8:20 p.m., Alyssa had been unconscious for nearly 2 hours. That was critical time that could have saved her life. But Christy didn't call 911 right away. Instead, she brought the other kids inside first, leaving Alyssa alone in the car. Only after that did she go back to check on her. She later claimed this was the moment she realized Alyssa wasn't okay. That's hard to believe. If she was so worried, why hadn't she already called for help? Instead of dialing 911, Christy's first call was to her brother Nate, an EMT. By the time he arrived, Alyssa was cold to the touch and had no pulse. Only then, at 8:25 p.m., did Christy finally call for help. For the next 15 minutes, Nate desperately tried to revive Alyssa while waiting for paramedics to arrive. But after everything she had already been through, it was too late. At 8:52 p.m., Alyssa was rushed to Parkview LaGrange Hospital. When she arrived at 9:07 p.m., the medical staff immediately saw the bruises on her little body. For the next 47 minutes, they did everything they could to save her. They even administered Narcan, just in case she had been exposed to any substances. But it was too late. At 9:54 p.m., Alissa Guernsey was pronounced dead. She was only 16 months old. By 10:10 p.m., the Schaffers had reported her passing to the Department of Child Services. 3 hours later, Alyssa's body was taken to the St. Joseph Forensic Center in Fort Wayne for an autopsy. Dr. Scott Wagner, the forensic pathologist, quickly confirmed what many had feared. Alyssa hadn't died from an accident or an illness. Her death was the result of a traumatic head injury. But that wasn't all. As Dr. Wagner examined her, he uncovered a horrifying truth. Alyssa's tiny body bore the marks of repeated abuse. Her head was covered in bruises. More were found on her face and left thigh. Inside her mouth, she had 2 cuts on her gums, one fresh, one older. Her once soft blonde hair was missing in patches, torn from her scalp. Unlike Dr. 𝐬𝐫𝐫, who had dismissed it as a medical issue, Dr. Wagner immediately recognized the hair loss as a result of physical trauma. Alyssa had also suffered a broken left elbow, an injury severe enough to damage her growth plate. And inside her brain, the pathologist found internal bleeding. The cause? A bilateral septal hematoma, something that only happens from repeated blunt force trauma. A toxicology report confirmed that the only medication in Alyssa's system was the Narcan given by hospital staff. This directly contradicted Christie's claims that she had been giving Alyssa the Vicodin that doctors had prescribed. Christie had been lying all along. There was no more room for excuses, no more deception. Alyssa had been abused for months, and the final injury had taken her life. Her voice had been silenced forever. Now, there was only one thing left to do: get justice for Alyssa. At first, it seemed like that would be simple. The medical examiner had ruled her death a homicide. The evidence was overwhelming. But instead of charging Christie with murder, prosecutor Jeff Weibel took an unusual approach. He presented the case to a grand jury. This decision made the legal process more closed off, less transparent. And the result was a disgrace. Despite everything, Christie Schaffer was not charged with murder. She wasn't even charged with manslaughter. Instead, she was convicted of neglect of a dependent. And the punishment? A mere 10-year sentence. 6 years were suspended. And then, in a shocking turn, Judge Scott Vanderbeck modified the sentence again, allowing Christie to walk free after serving just 77 days. A child's life was worth only 77 days behind bars. But why? Many suspected that the answer lay in Christie's family connections. But the public refused to stay silent. Outraged by the injustice, a group of mothers formed Alyssa's Army, a movement dedicated to fighting for Alyssa. Another group, Baby Alyssa Cries for Justice, gathered thousands of signatures demanding that the case be reopened. But despite their efforts, the system refused to listen. However, justice would catch up with Christie in another way. In November 2013, she was arrested again, this time for her role in a methamphetamine operation. Because this violated her parole, she was finally sentenced to 6 more years in prison. Meanwhile, Alyssa's mother, Kelly Sprunger, filed a civil lawsuit against Christie and Matthew Schaffer for wrongful death. She also took legal action against Dr. 𝐬𝐽𝐵, arguing that his failure to report the signs of abuse had contributed to Alyssa's suffering. In August 2014, the court ruled in Dr. 𝐬𝐽𝐵's favor, dismissing the medical malpractice claim. But the lawsuit against the Schaffers moved forward. Alissa Guernsey's life was short, but her story left a lasting impact. Her case exposed deep flaws in the child protection system, the medical field, and the justice system. It forced people to ask hard questions about how easily a child can slip through the cracks and how many others might be suffering in silence. Supporters of Alyssa's cause began calling her the little dragonfly. In many cultures, dragonflies symbolize transformation and the presence of spirits. Some believe that they carry messages from those who have passed on, visiting their loved ones in moments of need. Alyssa's story should never be forgotten. It is a heartbreaking reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. The system failed her. The people who should have been her safety net let her down. But her memory lives on, in her family, in the thousands of people who still fight for justice in her name. And maybe, just maybe, in the dragonflies that flutter by, reminding us of the little girl who deserved so much more.